Money FM 89.3, the best of Saturday mornings. Wide World on Money FM 89.3.
Australia has spoken, as we all know. Last weekend, the results are in. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour Party secured a second term, but not without some drama along the way. The election saw a huge shift, including opposition leader Peter Dutton losing his seat. A political earthquake, if you will, with lasting effects. Here to talk more about it, joining us, Jason Dasey, career international journalist, founder, CEO of Cockatoo Media, joining us from the lovely environs of Brisbane. Jason, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Glenn. Hello, Neil, and good morning to all the Money FM listeners.
All right, many of us have been following this all week. We've seen it and stuff, but now that we're kind of a weekend, what has the seismic shift, or at least the pundits, what are they saying about the result of the elections?
Well, of course, the election was held last Saturday, the same day as the Singapore election. The members of the 48th Parliament of Australia were selected, and we were expecting Anthony Albanese's centre-left Labor government to retain power, but maybe in a minority situation with the hung parliament. But it turned out to be a massive swing for the Labor Party, and they started off with 77 seats. They've won 14 already. They're up to 91, still seats to be counted. And Peter Dutton became the first opposition leader in history to lose his seat. The coalition, the centre-right Liberal National Party, winning just 40 seats compared to 53 in 2022. So that was the big story, that we did expect Anthony Albanese to win, but we were shocked by the margin of victory, given that Anthony Albanese wasn't a particularly impressive Prime Minister. The Labor Party didn't solve a lot of the issues that Australians are facing, like cost of living and housing, and yet the Labor Party's been returned to power with an increased majority.
Well, let's start with Peter Dutton. You mentioned there he was the outgoing opposition leader, lost his own seat, as you said, unprecedented stuff. Why do you think that was? Because we know that he aligned himself initially with the culture wars, with Trump's policies, lots of anti-woke sentiments, and it seems to have been a huge backlash for him, Jason.
That's true, Neil. There are a lot of parallels with Canada, of course, which also held an election recently. And Peter Dutton's a former police officer. He's from Brisbane. He held the seat of Dixon, which is in the northern part of Brisbane. And he was actually going neck and neck with Anthony Albanese in recent months. And in fact, the coalition, his party, his joint party with the National Party, were ahead of Labor up until March. But Peter Dutton made the mistake of firstly aligning himself with Trump, which he tried to walk back, but then watering down his message. He sort of would follow what the Labor Party did towards the end. We had 4 debates, and he was echoing a lot of what Anthony Albanese was saying in terms of concessions for the electorate. And in the end, I think his message was diluted, and yet people still associated him with Donald Trump. It was an absolute disastrous election for the coalition, the worst probably in history that they've had, and never have we seen someone like Peter Dutton, being the opposition leader, lose his seat. We've seen prime ministers lose seats, but not opposition leaders.
Jason, speak to, this kind of surprise, actually. Everybody was figuring there'd be a little more nationalism, a little more, some of the themes we've seen in some of other elections, not only in Asia, but obviously in the U.S. and Europe. But what are you trending? What are you seeing? Are people getting tired of that message, or are they kind of reverting to old ways? How do you explain, what these results actually are looking like? I know it's early days, but what's the sense? What's the feeling that you're getting?
Well, I think when Donald Trump was returned or came back as president last November, there was sort of a sense of euphoria for a lot of the right-wing parties across the world. And, of course, in recent months with his tariffs, we've seen that go pear-shaped. So there's a lot of instability in the world, particularly in our region, the Asia-Pacific region. And I just think that voters here in Australia felt that Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party would offer a bit more security. It's unusual, isn't it, that you have a centre-left party that is seen as a more safe pair of hands. I mean, Peter Dutton offered many sort of incentives, like he wanted to cut the fuel tax by 50% for the first year. But he had a bit of bad luck because fuel prices have dropped here in Australia to around $1.45, $1.50 per litre. And he was unlucky with all the anti-Trump rhetoric. And I just think that people saw that while the Labor government here hasn't done a lot in the last 3 years, they are probably seen as a bit of a safer bet in very uncertain times.
Jason, I look at Australia's situation very positively. I was very impressed by not only the turnout, but the way it swung so drastically towards Albanese. And I think, do you wonder if this is not the beginnings of the ends of the old Australian stereotype, which is a bit right-wing, a bit parochial, a bit insular, a bit anti-foreigner? You know, everyone remembers the white-only immigration policy of the 1960s and 70s. This is now a new, younger, vibrant, multicultural, increasingly multiracial Australia that doesn't necessarily stand up to that nonsense from the likes of Dutton anymore.
I think there's some truth in that, Neil, but there is also a bit of an intolerance for the elites here, a bit like we've seen in the US and in the UK as well. I think there are feelings that some of the elites here in the inner cities are kind of not in touch with reality. So I think if there was someone that had a strong message in the centre-right party, the Liberal Party, then they could reach across. But certainly the young voters definitely went with Anthony Albanese and Labor Party, and female voters turned against Peter Dutton and the Liberal National Coalition, so much so that a woman called Susan Lee is touted to be the next leader of the Liberal National Party, and that would be a huge step to have a female leader of the Conservative Party down here. But I would say more that the messaging was all wrong when it came to the campaign. I think, a centre-right party can still win power here with the right kind of message.
Just to follow up on that, I've been reading around. They're calling it the death of the Liberal Party. Conservatism has no meaning. It has no character. It has no identity. They're talking about a vacuum of leadership in the Conservative movement in Australia. They're saying they're at their lowest ebb in almost 100 years. I mean, what's your take on where do the Liberals, the Conservative centre-right politics in Australia, where does it go from here?
Well, Neil, they've definitely got problems. And, for example, my mum lives in a very affluent area of Sydney called North Sydney, and she's more a progressive voter. But people in her area would never vote for the Liberal Party anymore. And we've seen people in the urban areas of Australia, in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, where I am, in Perth, just moving away from the Liberal Party, and also to an extent moving away from the Labor Party. And when we look at the primary vote for each of the parties, the Labor Party had 34.7%. The Liberal Party, the National Coalition, had 32.2%. So it was a bit behind, but people are going towards independence now, and the so-called teals, the independent teals. The Greens didn't do well in the election here.
Just explain who the independent teals are, Jason.
The independent teals, well, there are a few of them across the cities, and they are quite progressive, and they are looking at environmental issues. And in many ways, these are people that would normally be in the Liberal Party, but because the Liberal Party has not given a strong enough message, the voters in the areas like where my mum lives have moved to different areas.
Fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting, Jason. Now, Jason, and we're speaking with Jason Dasey, international journalist, founder, CEO of Cockatoo Media, joining us from Brisbane. Jason, one of the elements of the Labor victory was influenced by the cost of living issues among folks in Australia. What have we seen in this past week from Albanese and his party to maybe address that? Have they started talking about other things they might do to help the working class, the working people of Australia, bring those costs down?
Well, they are trying to give incentives for first home buyers, and so they can actually give quite a small deposit to buy a home. And as Neil would know, being a former home owner here in Australia, he owned a place in the Gold Coast in Queensland, not too far from where I am. It's very, very hard for young voters to get into the property market. And just to give an example, as you guys know, I was a Singapore permanent resident for 20 years, and I love Singapore. And the fact that we can go to a hawker centre in Singapore and still get a bowl of noodles for $5 or less. Here in Australia, you're going to a food court now and paying up to $20 for a simple bowl of fried noodles. So there are a lot of issues that Australians are facing, and that's why if a conservative party like the Liberal Coalition could run on cost of living, then they would probably do better than they have in this election. But the problem was that they got very, very splintered in terms of their messaging, and people just sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, I don't think you've got the solution, so I'm just going to stick with what I know.
Kind of reminds us of something that happened in North America not too long ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Let's have a nice word for Albanese here. I mean, I listened to a podcast he did recently, The Rest is Politics. I know he comes across as a little bland, but what he does also come across as very sincere, very authentic, very empathetic, and he's really about the job. He's really about public service. You mentioned earlier, Jason, correctly about the elites, this sense of elites and people just out to line their own pockets. Whatever anybody else may think about Albanese, they never have that perception of him, do they? He does seem to come across as a sincere, authentic guy dedicated to public service.
Well, I would say yes and no, Neil. Being someone that walks the centre path here in Australia, I would say that initially, yes, Anthony Albanese did a great job. You know, he grew up in a single-parent home in the city part of Sydney, didn't have a lot of money, supports the South Sydney Rabbitohs, the National Rugby League team. But he's made several missteps since he became Prime Minister in 2022. And one of the bad ones just before the election, he bought a $4.3 million home in the central coast of New South Wales. Just as many Aussies were struggling to find housing. So he's not perfect. In fact, there are people that say that he hasn't been a great Prime Minister, but certainly compared to Peter Dutton, I think people felt that he was more authentic and he was more of an Aussie battler, as they say down here.
And just following on from that, one thing I did find interesting from the media perspective, look, you and I both know it's been widely accepted, although never entirely true, that a political leader could not win without the blessing of Rupert Murdoch. That's been going on for decades. In the lead up to this election, as you know, the Murdoch media, through the newspapers, through the shock jocks, through the TV hosts, they were hammering the Labour Party day and night, and yet in the end it had no impact. Is this two things? Is this confirming the decline of Rupert Murdoch's influence in Australia? And also, two, just an acceptance now we have a changed media landscape in Australia?
I definitely think that the Murdoch media has less influence here. And we're not just talking about the newspapers like The Australian, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, and so on, and Sky News on TV. But there are other elements of American media across the world that tends to be against centre-left parties. We've seen that in the US. But I have right-wing friends in Australia who claim that the ABC is very far left and very anti-conservative. So I would say it's kind of pretty much 50-50, but definitely the Murdoch media has less influence now than it used to because media's become a lot more fractured and people aren't buying newspapers as they did when, you and I started out in newspapers. Yeah. So, yeah, I think these days it's a lot more, social influences and social media. And that was one thing about the Labor campaign. They were very disciplined when it came to their messaging, and they made themselves a small target. And in the end, that was enough to increase their majority.
All right, finally, Jason, what does the result of the election mean, if anything, for Singaporeans living in Australia, Singaporeans traveling to Australia, going to school in Australia? Is there any implication for any of those groups of folks?
I think it's good news for Singaporeans, for Malaysians, for people in Southeast Asia, because Peter Dutton was running on an anti-immigrant platform to a certain extent. Of course, that doesn't necessarily affect Singaporean students or business people, but I definitely think that Anthony Albanese, he's a good friend of Singapore. He's always been pro-Asia. So the fact that he retained power means that we are going to see an Australian government that is more pro-Asia, that is more looking towards Southeast Asia, towards ASEAN, whereas if Dutton had won, we would have seen a government more aligned with the MAGA values of Donald Trump in the United States.
Got it. Jason, we're going to leave it there. Jason Dasey, international journalist, founder of Cockatoo Media, joining us from Australia. Thanks for your time today and your insights, Jason.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Glenn. And do go to my favourite vegetarian stall there in Topayo if you can.
I will do it straight after this show, my friend.
Take care, Jason.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All the best.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.